Okay. Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Hasidut. We are continuing with the life and teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. Tonight we have a number of smaller insights in the Baal Shem Tov that we will elucidate, and we have two longer ones, a bit more complicated, totally profound, and a few stories here and there. So we'll start with, for those who are following, on Samach Daled, Torah Samach Daled, and it says, Shemati Mimori, I heard from my teacher, meaning the Baal Shem Tov, Shem Rav Sadia Gaon. The Baal Shem Tov was quoting the person called Sadia Gaon. He lived approximately 1,000 years ago. He was one of the leaders of the Babylonian community. At that time, it was actually the largest Jewish community. And there was a series of Gaonim, of geniuses, and like the Vilna Gaon. So this was Sadia Gaon. So the Baal Shem Tov is quoting Sadia Gaon, who said, Shera'ui le'adam sheyilmod micheshek ha'dvarim gashmiim ech lachsoch avodat Hashem yitbarach ba'avato. So the Sadia Gaon said that it's fitting, it's good advice for a person to learn from their own desires for physical things how to translate the same kind of desire or passion for the service of God and to love God. That's the whole statement. The Baal Shem Tov obviously felt this was very important to give over to his students. So I'll say it again, that it's a good thing for a person to look at the desires that they have, the passions that they have for physical things. It could be food, it could be sexual, it could be for a certain hobby, it could be all kinds of physical desires, but to learn from it how to apply that same kind of desire and passion for spiritual matters. So this is from the Sadia Gaon. This obviously the Baal Shem Tov is giving it over because it fit very well into his philosophy of unifying physical and spiritual. And as we've quoted many times, the verse that the Baal Shem Tov used all the time is B'chol derachecha de'ehu. In all of your ways, know him. All of your ways means all of your physical reality, your mundane activities, that there's a way to know God in each and every activity, each and every situation in life. Now, one of the reasons I chose to give this over is that in Hasidic circles, in Hasidic tradition, there are certain traditions as to who the Baal Shem Tov was. In other words, what were his previous incarnations? And within Hasidic tradition, it's thought that this Sadia Gaon was incarnated into the Baal Shem Tov. So here it's very interesting that the Baal Shem Tov is quoting him. Many times the Baal Shem Tov quotes the Gemara, the Mishnah, the Zohar. But here, it's not the ordinary thing for him to quote one of the Gaonim. So here he's quoting Saadia Gaon, and we have this tradition that perhaps, again, I don't know if we can say absolutely, but there is a tradition. It could be that the Baal Shem Tov hinted to it while he was alive, is that he is an incarnation of the Baal Shem Tov. So since we're mentioning this, so who else is incarnated into the Baal Shem Tov according to Hasidic tradition? So there's two other ideas. One is that part of the Baal Shem Tov soul is what's called a new soul, meaning a soul that has never incarnated before. That's why it's called a new soul. It's never been in a physical body before. And this goes back to the teachings of the Arizal, that when Adam and Chava ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, there were certain parts of his soul that were not involved in eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Somehow they were spared that experience. If you look into the teachings of the Arizal, so he explains that everyone comes from either Cain or Abel, and ultimately from Adam. Adam is what is called a all-inclusive soul, a neshama kolelet. So every soul that would ever be born was part of Adam. But the Ari says that there were certain special souls that, we'll use the word, spared from partaking in that sin. And so the tradition is that part of the Baal Shem Tov soul was a new soul. This makes a lot of sense because the Baal Shem Tov was so innovative, and he altered Judaism forever by starting the Hasidic movement, and his teachings were highly innovative, new, creative. And so the idea is that part of his soul is a new soul. And then, according to tradition, there's one other part of his soul, and that is a hidden tzaddik, a hidden righteous person who lived in Tzfat. And the story that is told, how did this hidden tzaddik become part of the Baal Shem Tov, is that he was a very, very righteous person, but very hidden, very humble, and virtually no one knew what a great soul he was. So they sent Eliyahu Navi to this soul in Tzfat, and they wanted to make this soul like known by everyone. And Eliyahu Navi said, just tell me what you did on your bar mitzvah day. Tell me what you did on your bar mitzvah day. And this soul said, no, I can't tell you. It's just between me and God. It was obviously he did some kind of a mitzvah. He had some kind of kavana. He had a certain kind of prayer that he said on his bar mitzvah day. But out of this great humbleness, he would not share it, even with Eliyahu Navi, even with Elijah the prophet. And so Eliyahu goes back to heaven and says, he wouldn't reveal to me what special thing he did at his bar mitzvah. And so there was a discussion like, well, how can we pay this soul back? How can we encourage this soul? And so it turns out that this soul was totally hidden his whole life. He was considered like one of the hidden tzaddikim, No one knew anything about him, but it was declared in heaven that at some point he would be incarnated into someone who would be very well known and would change the world. So what I just told you, these are Hasidic traditions about the soul of the Baal Shem Tov. I heard these from Rav Ginsburg. So that was our first insight for the evening. And now we're going to do the next one. That was Samach Daled, and now Samach Hey. And I've mentioned before that sometimes a one-liner from the Baal Shem Tov, or one thought within even a more complex thought, can be taken up in future generations and made like a centerpiece of their teachings. And the example that I used up to now was the idea of the three-stage process that the Baal Shem Tov said that every spiritual or even physical process that a person goes through three steps. Many of you have heard this many times: Hachna'ah, submission; Havdalah, separation; and Havdalah, sweetening. And we found it in one of the Torahs that we gave over in previous weeks. And it wasn't like the Baal Shem wrote a whole treatise about this three-stage process. But the example I used that Rav Ginsburg uses this all the time to explain a myriad of examples of situations where we can see this three-pronged process playing itself out. So the one we're going to learn here is also, this is one of the classic statements of the Baal Shem Tov, and it's in one sentence. So what is it? So it says, as many of these Torahs begin, Shemati Mimori, I heard from my teacher. My teacher is the Baal Shem Tov. Because remember, the Baal Shem Tov didn't write anything of his own. What we're learning from the Keter Shem Tov is a compilation of Torahs from his students, or students of his students that were given over the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. It is Samach Hey. It is Samach Hey that we're learning. And it says like this: Hamedabek et atzmo b'chelek echad min ha'achdut davuk b'kulo v'hu adin ha'hefech. So the Baal Shem Tov says very simply that one who clings to a part of a whole unity clings to the whole thing. And also, this is the same with the opposite. That's the full idea here. Someone who clings to a part of a wholeness is actually holding on to the whole thing. And it's true about the opposite as well. When I first heard this, I actually heard it from in the Slonim Rebbe's Nativot Shalom. And he actually uses this idea many, many times. And the example that he uses is if someone is on a ship and falls off the ship and they're flailing in the water, but the ship keeps going. It's not like a little rowboat. It's a big ship and it can't just stop. It's just going. And he's yelling out and someone throws him a line. And he grabs onto the line. So the Slonim Rebbe says, as long as he's holding on to the line, meaning to a part of the ship, he's connected to the whole ship. If he lets go, he's not connected anymore. But as long as you hold on to a part of a whole, you're holding on to the whole thing. The example that I use all the time is that in the Talmud, there are a number of examples of 1/60th. There's a whole series of things that are 1/60th of something else. So the one that I'm concerned here with is, it says that Shabbat is 1/60th of the world to come. While we're speaking about it, what are some of the others? Sleep is 1/60th of death. Dreams are 1/60th of prophecy. Fire is 1/60th of Gehenna. In English, we'll call it hell or purgatory. And honey is 1/60th of the manna, the food from heaven in the desert. One could ask, why 1 in 60? Why not 1 in 70, 1 in 80? Because it's a symbolic number. And the secret is that Samach, the letter Samach equals 60. And the shape of the Samach is a circle. That's the idea of a whole. So when you say something is 1/60th, well, if it's in the circle, it may be 1/60th, but it's part of the whole. So going back to Shabbat, so someone might say, Shabbat is 1/60th of the world to come. One could say, that's it? It doesn't sound like very much. It's 1/60th of the world to come. But when you apply this idea here, if you hold on to a part, you're holding on to the whole. So if someone is completely invested in Shabbat, focused in the loop, it's almost a pun, the loop is the Samach, is the 1/60th, then they're connected to the entire world to come. I think I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again, that I was teaching over this concept at Hebrew U back in the day with the overseas students spending a year abroad. And it was part of a whole discussion about Shabbat. And I mentioned that this idea of 1/60th of the world to come, you're holding on to the whole. And I termed it like having a moment on Shabbat, having a moment that you really feel ultimate peace. You feel everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be. You have no questions. You're in the moment. Everything seems absolutely perfect. So that's I called a moment. But it's the idea of that 1/60th, but it's connecting you to something so much greater. A few weeks or a few months later, I don't remember, I had a whole group of students from Hebrew U at my house for Shabbat. And big, there were like 20 students. And fairly near where I was sitting, a young woman, just kind of almost out of nowhere in the middle of the meal, turns to me and says, "Have you had your moment yet?" And since I had given over this teaching weeks or months ago, at first, I didn't really understand what she was talking about. And then it clicked that she must have heard me talk about this. And I think it was at lunch. And the truth is, I had already had my moment going out early in the morning. It's very quiet. The birds are chirping. The sun is out. The sky is blue. It's Shabbos. And you just kind of melt into bliss. So I told her about my moment, but that's what the Baal Shem is saying here. Now, I want to expand this with a teaching from Rav Ginsburg. He says that there are three things that their very essence is wholeness. Actually, we're going to say four. God is the epitome of unity, of oneness, of uniqueness. And so, if you do a mitzvah, if you do a good deed, if you have a pure intent, if you have a deep prayer, so at that moment, you're just doing one mitzvah. We're a finite human being in a very physical world. And yet, at that moment, you're a part holding on to the whole. But then Rav Ginsburg said that there are three things that, if they're not whole, it's as if there's something essentially missing. In other words, in the physical world, you could have a whole basket of apples. And the description is you have a whole basket full of apples. Now, if you take one apple out and you would ask someone, could you please describe what this basket, they would still say it's a basket full of apples. In other words, missing one apple isn't going to change the reality all that much. But Rav Ginsburg teaches there are three things that if they're not whole, then there is something missing. The first one is Torah, and we even have a halacha. If even one letter is missing from the Torah, or a letter is written incorrectly, or is partly erased or broken, then publicly you can't read this Torah. It's lost its essence of being called a Torah that is fitting to be read in public. So that's one thing. The other thing is Am Yisrael. And that's this idea that is very much from the Baal Shem Tov and is quoted extensively in Hasidic teachings, that all of Am Yisrael is like one neshama. And if there's even one Jew, for whatever reason, missing from the equation, it's as if Am Yisrael is not whole anymore. And that's why it says in the book of Shmuel, God says, basically, no one will be left behind. No one will be left out. So Am Yisrael, by definition, is a whole entity. And the third thing is Eretz Yisrael. And Eretz Yisrael, as an entity, to really be called Eretz Yisrael, needs to be the complete Eretz Yisrael. And throughout history, we actually have never really attained all of the land of Israel. When Mashiach comes, Bezrat Hashem, not only will we attain all of Eretz Yisrael, but we have the tradition that Eretz Yisrael will spread out, the holiness of Eretz Yisrael will spread out to the entire world. So these are ideas that I heard from Rav Ginsburg, and it's based on this one short sentence from the Baal Shem Tov. But especially for our purposes, it's so important to understand how a single mitzvah. Now, I'm mentioning this because tomorrow night is Hanukkah. And we will be lighting physical lights. And we know that the word in Hebrew for light is or, Aleph, Vav, Resh, equals 207. 207 also equals Ein Sof, the infinite one, the infinite energy of God. Here's an example. We're doing a single mitzvah in a certain moment, but in that moment, our physical light is connecting us to the Ein Sof, to the infinite light of God. The finite action of a finite human being in a finite moment of time is part of a much bigger whole. And we see this in a Kabbalistic idea that if you take the word mitzvah, mem, tzadi, vav, and hey, the vav and hey are the same as the last two letters of God's name, yud and hey, and vav and hey. So mitzvah and the last two letters of God's name are the same. If you take the mem and the tzadi of mitzvah and you exchange it in what's called atbash, where it exchanged the first letter of the alphabet for the last, the second letter for the second last, the mem and the tzadi translate into a yud and a hey. And here's just a very deep hint that doing a mitzvah connects us with the ineffable name of God. So this is a very important idea for all of us as we prepare to light candles for 8 days. Once again, it's a singular act in a singular moment by a finite human being in a finite world. And yet the light that we're lighting is the part, and we hold on to that. We're holding on to the whole. We're holding on to the Ein Sof. Okay, the next idea is Samach Zayin. And I do want to mention right now, I also heard this from Rav Ginsburg, that the Baal Shem Tov's favorite holiday was Hanukkah. Why? Because it was about light. When the Baal Shem Tov, remember, Baal Shem Tov was in the early 1700s. You didn't have electricity then. So all light was either from candles or oil or kerosene or lamps. But when the Baal Shem Tov would come into like any room in the night, he would always say, let's add more light. We need more light. Rav Ginsburg said that Hanukkah was the Baal Shem's favorite holiday because spreading the light, that's what the Baal Shem came into the world to do, was to take the light of God and infuse it and have it be integrated in each individual who would then shine it into the world. The next Torah we're doing is Samach Zayin. Says like this. This I'm giving over because one, it shows without the Baal Shem Tov even mentioning it, it's very, very Kabbalistic. And also it's a play on words. It's a very clever play on words to make his point. It's a relatively short Torah. It says, Malchut Nikra Dibor. The sphere of Malchut, kingdom, is called speech. In the Tikkunei Zohar, Malchut is described as connected to the mouth. Torah shel Baal Peh Karinin La. That Malchut is called it's actually literally the oral Torah, the master of the mouth. So Malchut is called speech. Umachshava v'kavana nikra bina. But thought and intent is called Bina, the higher sphere of Bina. Now, I'll just continue. Ukasher mechaber bein be'esach haTorah o tefillah beit bechinot elo. So he says that when a person in learning Torah or in prayer connects these two things, meaning thought or intent and speech, dayinu adibur ima kavana, meaning connecting speech and kavana, as mechaber makasher malchut ima bina. He's connecting the sphere of malchut with the sphere of bina. Then he says, besod, and this is the secret of a verse in the Song of Songs that says, Mi zot olam mina midbar. Who is this who is coming up from the desert? This is in the Song of Songs. One second. I'm just looking for the source here. Okay, I don't see it right here. Anyways, it's in the Song of Songs. And the play on words is, who is this who's coming up from the desert? Well, the word desert in Hebrew is midbar, which has the exact same letters as midaber, one who speaks. Me, it says, who is this who is coming up from the desert? So me, mem yud equals 50, is always connected to the 50 gates of Bina. I see that Dara puts the source in the 3rd chapter, the 6th verse of Shira Shirim. 3rd verse, 6th verse. 3rd chapter, 6th verse. So me, who, equals 50, which is Bina, the 50 gates of Bina. And Zot, this is always connected to Malchut. So in one verse, you have Mi, Zot, Bina, and Malchut coming up from the Midbar. But you can read it not coming up from the desert, but coming out of speech. When you connect intent and thought with speech, then you have this incredible connection. Now, one thing he doesn't say, but is really the background of this, is that Malchut and Bina are the two Heys in God's name. The Yud and the Hey, the first Hey is Bina. Vav and Hey, the second Hey is always Malchut. So here he's saying, and it sounds very Kabbalistic, but it's very practical, is how many times do we speak without thinking? Too often. We speak without thinking, or we say our prayers, we sing them, our lips are moving, but we could be a million miles away. And we're just mouthing the words from rote. We know them by heart. So this is one of many, many, many teachings from the Baal Shem Tov about this idea of connecting thought and speech. And then ultimately, thought and action. How many times do we act without thinking first? Baal Shem Tov is simply pointing out that very Kabbalistically, it's engraved in God's name, this idea of connecting thought and speech. And here he found this verse in the Song of Songs, which alludes to this. It's extremely intuitive, the way he's reading this. Mi zot Allah midbar. Allah means coming up. So how does a person elevate themselves? By connecting their thought and their intent to their speech and ultimately to their action. Okay, so we really going to have time for one more, and this is the longer, more complicated one. I have to be honest, this Torah is so deep and has so many levels to it. I most certainly will do my best to give this over. This is Torah Ayin, the 70th one, Torah Ayin. So it says like this, and I might not even read every word. It says, V'yara Shem kisar lirot. This is when Moshe sees the burning bush. But at first it says, and God saw that Moshe had turned to look. And there's a whole lot of teachings about this, about the idea of how much in life just passes us by because we don't notice. We don't take an interest. It goes in one ear and out another ear. But here, God saw that he sees a bush and it's burning, but it's not being consumed. Someone else might have just walked by and thought, that's strange, or not even thought it strange at all, just didn't even register. But God saw that Moshe stopped to look. Ki Moshe Rabbeinu yira shemahu klipa. He says, but to this point, Moshe thought that perhaps he had a part of him connected to what's called the klipa, to the outer shells. It just means he understood he was blemished, he had faults, and he was far from perfect. Ad Shamar Moshe Moshe. But at the burning bush, God sees that he turns to see, and he calls him. And this is one of 4 times in the entire Tanakh that God calls a person by their name twice. Moshe, Moshe. There's also Avram. There's Yaakov, Yaakov. And there's Shmuel, Shmuel. These are the only 4. Az Amar Hineni. And in the Torah, God called him by 2 names, and he said, Hineni, here I am. I'm here. I'm here for you. I'm ready to receive. So the Baal Shem explains, Va'inyan ki Moshe shemo kolel kol olamot, that Moshe's name, Moshe, included all the different worlds. Lakach shemo hukshalo, and therefore Moshe had a hard time with his name. And it will explain what this means. But a person's name represents who they are, their essence. And Moshe felt that his name, he had a problem with it because he understood that the 3 letters of his name, Mem, Shin, and Hey, were hinting that it includes all the different worlds. Just like the Shekhinah, the divine presence, includes all of the worlds. Domem, Someach, the Kol Nivraim, the mineral, the vegetable, and all creations. Tovim v'ra'im, for the good and not for the good. Moshe felt that reality consists of good and not so good, positive and negative. And he felt that that was his reality, and it was reflected in his own name. And so now the Baal Shem explains, Kach ot mem min Moshe haromez lemalchut kolel kola inyanim gamkein. And so the mem of Moshe's name, the first letter of his name, contains everything in the world. for the good and not so good. The ot shin kolel kol ruchot, and the letter shin includes all of the spirit, all of the spiritual world. Like the mem includes all of the physical world, the shin is all of the spiritual worlds. But hey, haneshamot, and the hey points to or hints to all souls. In short, what the Baal Shem is saying, that Moshe, when he looked at his own name, and we could also, something we've learned many, many times, when you take the name Moshe, the mem is water, mayim, and the shin is fire, water and fire. This is the symbol of all opposites. And so Moshe felt that not just his name, but his whole being included good and not so good. And therefore his name was a problem to him. Lakach shemo hukshalo. That's what the Baal Shem said. Therefore his name bothered him. For Darshu Chazal, Menorah Shkalim HaChodesh Roshi Teva Moshe. And the sages say that three things that begin with the letters of Moshe's name were difficult for him. Menorah, the menorah in the temple, the candelabrum. The shkalim, the mitzvah to take a half a shekel as a donation to the temple, and hachodesh, how to calculate the new moon. So if you go back, the mem of menorah, that's the mem of Moshe's name. The shin of shkalim is the shin of Moshe's name, and the ha-chodesh is the hay of Moshe's name. But what do these three things have to do with each other? The Gemara explains that these three things, when God commanded Moshe to make a menorah, to take the half shekel, and to calculate the Hebrew calendar, Moshe had a hard time understanding how these things work. What are their meanings? And God taught him. So here, it turns out that these three things that Moshe had a hard time understanding are the first letters of his own name. So the Baal Shem Tov is explaining that that's why his name bothered him. There was something about being an all-inclusive soul. In a certain way, we said that Adam was an all-inclusive soul. Moshe also included the soul of everyone of that generation. Continuing, aval be'emet shemo atzmo shalo. Okay, we said that already. Shemo kolel kol minei tov v'ra gamkein. So again, he's just repeating himself, that Moshe felt that his name included good and evil. And this was like a wonder to him. So this is like the Ikar, what he's saying. This is one of the most essential teachings of Kabbalah and Chassidut, is right here. So why was he so surprised? Because he understood that the Shekhinah is the ultimate unity. And it was hard for him, or it troubled him, or it was puzzling to him. How could a unification include two opposites? How does that work? How does good and evil, it's easy to separate them. This is good and this is evil. But how do you make a unity of good and evil? And the Baal Shem Tov says that Moshe was also trying to understand that how could ultimate unity include two opposites? And therefore he reflected it on his own name. How am I a composite of good and evil? How can I make a unity of that. Or as we've learned in a different context, when it says in the passage after the Shema, you should love God with all your heart and all your soul. The word heart is written in the plural. Lavavcha is considered plural. And the Midrash says, why plural? We only have one heart. The Midrash says with your Yetzer Tov and your Yetzer Hara, that you should love God with your good inclination and also your evil inclination. And this goes back to one of the Torahs we learned earlier, this idea of, one second. This idea that we can learn from even our physical desires or passions, which may not even be that good in that context, but we could actually learn from them to translate them into the good. That's what we learned from Saadia Gaon. So continuing, so he says, Ki ara hu kisei elatov. This is one of the Torahs that we learned in Keter Shem Tov. He says that evil ultimately is the seat of good. In other words, from anything that we perceive as evil, as negative, and on a daily level, on a personal level, we run into things that seem to be somewhat negative, and we're always trying to figure out what positive is going to come out of this. But the Baal Shem taught that all evil ultimately is a platform for good. And he brings an example, Kamo ufaro hi kriv. So the example he brings, and Pharaoh came close. So this is when we left Egypt, and a few days later, Pharaoh says, what did we do? We let Israel leave our service? We're going after them. And Pharaoh is chasing after them, and he traps them at the sea. And in the text, it says, Uparo hi kriv. And we translate it as, and Pharaoh came close. He was getting close with his chariots. But the actual grammar is, and Pharaoh caused others to draw close. By his getting closer to Israel and threatening Israel, it caused Israel to turn to God in prayer, and they cried out. And we have the same example in Megillat Esther, when Haman suggests to the king, I'll give you 10,000 pieces of silver if you let me destroy all the Jews. And Achashverosh agreed. And it says he took off his ring and he put it on Haman's finger. And the sages say that that act, in other words, he was agreeing to do total genocide on the Jewish people. And the sages say that that act did more to arouse Israel to tshuva than anything else could have done. This is an example of ra kisei latov. Evil is a platform for good. And this is what the Baal Shem brings as his example. And Moshe is trying to figure this out. How does it work? Pharaoh is about to destroy the Jewish people, and that's part of the ultimate unity. How does that work? Okay, 1 second. Oh, okay, and then he brings another example. I'm not going to read every word now. He brings another example that we learned already, that sometimes, how can evil be a platform for good? So one of the examples he brings is that a righteous person sees someone doing something evil. Doesn't even mean that the person themselves is evil, but they're doing something not very good right now. And the righteous person thinks to themselves and turns to God and says, thank God I'm not like that. Thank God you have inspired me towards the good. So the Baal Shem Tov says that thought alone is something good that can come out of something evil. That was just an example. There's a million examples that could be brought. And then he says, something we've learned also many times, is v'chein machshava ra hu kisei al davar tov. Also an evil thought, and we learned this in conjunction with the Baal Shem Tov's teaching about prayer, where we get what's called strange thoughts. We're trying to concentrate on prayer, and we get these out of the box, out of the stadium thoughts, and not very positive thoughts in the middle of are trying to connect to God. So he said then is that if you can grab it at the moment and understand how to turn that evil thought into something positive, in other words, it's coming for a tikkun. That's another example of how evil is a platform for good. Now he brings it back to Moshe. V'zeh shekatuv Moshe pam echad lo amar hineni. So God calls Moshe twice. Moshe, Moshe. Moshe only says hineni after the second time. So the Baal Shem points out that he didn't say hineni after the first time. Why is that? Because when God even said Moshe once, he's still involved in his self-image, his self-identity, that I as a person have good and not so good. How can I feel like a unified human being? How can I direct these two opposites into a unity? Ki kishenigla b'sneh madriga tachshona niftachu kol makorot elyonot ad lamata. That this experience at the burning bush, in a way, opened up all of the gates of understanding for Moshe. And so when God says Moshe a second time, excuse me, and he says, Umatama lo yivaerasna. And Moshe is thinking, that's why he turned, like, why is this snap burning and not being consumed? This is like a symbol of two opposites. Where do you hear of a bush burning and not being consumed in the flames? She'yachlu b'yitabru hara shehu asneh ad she'al pam bet Moshe, because the fire could burn up the bush. So he didn't understand how these two things can work together. How does water and fire work together? How does good and evil work together? How is this part of unity within God, creation, and myself? Ad she'amar lo pam bet Moshe, until God called him the second time. Remember, only 4 people in the entire Tanakh are called by their name twice. Shenaseh al yedei zeh yichud v'chibur v'kishur madriga tachtona be'elyona az amar hineni. So when God called him a second time, all that was the revelation he had. The revelation at that moment was that everything is part of the unity. Good and not so good, the Yetzer Tov, the Yetzer Hara, past, present, future, everything opened up to him. And he was able to understand when God called him a second time, then he said, Hineni, I am here. He had an epiphany that he had escaped him his whole life. His whole life, he had struggled with his name, which means his identity. Who am I as a person? How do I deal with all these different energies that are running through me? And that's the end of the Torah. As I said before we started, there's so much here. There's so much here. And since I mentioned Megillat Esther, that's one of the secrets. This whole Torah is like a secret for this idea of drinking on Purim. Ad lo yada bein Baruch Mordechai ve'or Haman. To drink on Purim until one doesn't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. It's a whole secret of how to deal with good and evil in this world, how to understand how God is running the world, and what to do with it and what to think about it. So let's hope that this Hanukkah, when we light the candles, that we all have a million questions, but if even for a moment, like we learned in the beginning of the evening, even for a moment, we can hold on to a bigger whole, that the physical light is a gateway, is a chariot, is a platform to reaching the Ein Sof. And may God do miracles and wonders this Hanukkah. May we finish this war. May, for the sake of the whole world, may we be victorious like we were at the time of the Maccabees. And may the lights of Hanukkah spread to the whole world and bring wonders and miracles. Nisim v'niflaot.